Welcome to the debate. Our source material today really engages with some profound theological concepts. We're talking about human identity, obedience, and the relationship between spiritual grace and physical actions, especially through a critique of modern pride ideology.
Right. And that intersection creates this really intense theological tension. The source material is constantly referencing God's judgment based on works. You see that all over Revelation, but also his condemnation of pride, which, is foundational.
Exactly, which leads us to our essential question. Given the text's strong emphasis on both of these things, which one is presented as the primary metric of a life authored by God? Is it embodied obedience, or is it the rejection of self-sovereignty? I'm going to argue that the material really foregrounds embodied obedience, the works, as the necessary proof of whose will is truly operating.
And I'm going to take the other side of that. I think the material's most powerful critique is aimed at that foundational sin of pride, the enthroning of the self. So for me, the rejection of self-sovereignty is the deeper, the more defining issue. The works you're pointing to are just the inevitable result of that.
Well, my position really rests on the undeniable weight the text gives to visible action. Christianity, as it's defined here, isn't some private internal feeling. It is, and I'm quoting, a covenant of embodied obedience. The body is central to the covenant, and the evidence for this focus is just explicit. I know your works. That phrase opens every single letter to the 7 churches in Revelation. It's not an afterthought. It is the first thing he says, the immediate criterion for assessment.
Ownership. It states, and this is from 1 Corinthians 6, you are not your own. You are bought with a price. The body is a temple, and if God owns the body, and Matthew 10 confirms he judges both soul and body, then misusing that property, well, the physical works become the definitive evidence of rebellion. And one more thing, the material is careful to say, grace doesn't cancel works. It quotes Ephesians 2:10. Grace writes them. Works are the visible script. Philadelphia is praised because its works align. Thyatira is judged. It's all about the works.
I see that, and it's a compelling point about accountability, but I think it overlooks the origin of the transgression. I would argue that works are the symptom, not the disease. The spiritual sickness starts with that conceptual claim of self-sovereignty, the assertion that I am my own. That happens before any physical act. The material insists the deepest sin is pride, right? It quotes James 4.6. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So humility, this conceptual surrender, has to come first.
But does it?
Well, look at the sequence the material lays out from Romans 1. It's crucial. First, God's authority is rejected. That leads to truth being redefined by the self. That, in turn, leads to desire being enthroned as identity. And only then, at the end of that chain, does the body become an altar to the self. So this identity pride is the fundamental problem. The works you're citing are just the physical, the manifestation of that deeper intellectual rebellion. And we have to be careful with our terms, which the text itself points out. The Hebrew word toeva, or abomination, it labels practices, not people. The text is insistent on this. The gospel crucifies the self. It doesn't annihilate the person. That surrender of the self-authored life, I think that's the true metric.
I appreciate the focus on the internal source, but let's go back to ownership for a second, because I think the text presents it as non-negotiable proof. If the body is explicitly bought with a price, then misusing that property is not just a poor manifestation, it is a fundamental breach of covenantal property rights.
Okay, but
So the question then becomes, how does anyone, God or the world, verify that conceptual surrender you're talking about? The only tangible verification is the works. If the works, the embodied actions, remain entirely self-authored, then any claim of conceptual humility is it's hollow. The specific works confirm the theft of property and the denial of God's ownership. They install what the text calls the abomination in the temple.
it's a powerful way to frame the consequences, but it misses the mechanism of the rebellion. If the body is just property being stolen, why does the text spend so much time diagnosing the internal intellectual corruption in Romans 1 before the action even occurs? It details a theological exchange, trading God's truth for a lie.
The core violation is the claim, my identity is sovereign. That has to come before the action. The body isn't just property, it's a spiritual altar. It's either an altar where the self is sacrificed, which is the Christian identity, or it's an altar where the self is enthroned, which is pride. The critical issue is who defines the human being, and that is a conceptual act. If we don't address that intellectual self-worship first, we're just treating symptoms.
So this brings us right back to that tension.
It does. I mean, the text insists salvation is not by works, lest anyone should boast. So if we use works as the primary criteria, as Revelation seems to, how do we stop that from just collapsing into a works-based standard? Especially with something as complex as sexual identity, which the text itself says results from that prior rejection of God. We need to be precise here.
I think the solution is in how we understand the function of works. Grace is not passive permission, it is active divine authorship. The judgment isn't based on earning salvation, it's based on assessing the source of the actions. Are these actions authored by the Spirit, or are they authored by the self? Revelation proves judgment is works-based. I know your works. Because the works are the revealing mechanism, they show the heart's true allegiance. Laodicea isn't condemned for not doing enough good things. It's condemned because its works contradicted its self-image. It claimed to be rich, but its deeds proved it was poor. The text is unambiguous. What is done in the flesh matters because it demonstrates God's authorship. The embodied obedience is the proof that the pride has been crucified.
But I'm just not convinced focusing on the result over the cause is the right foundation for genuine conversion. If we only condemn the visible practice, we risk demanding behavioral change without the necessary conceptual repentance. You have to recognize that your claim, I define myself, is the actual error. If someone just changes their behavior without surrendering that underlying pride, they've only exchanged one kind of self-righteousness for another.
But if the surrender is genuine, the writing must change. And this isn't just about the individual, it's about the community. This brings us to Thyatira. My emphasis on embodied obedience is really solidified when you look at the communal imperative. The abomination in the temple isn't just the individual body, it can be the church itself. Thyatira is condemned because it tolerates Jezebel, which the text defines as religious authority blessing sexual rebellion. So for the faithful community, insisting on visible standards of body use, of works, is non-negotiable. This is why the church must speak. The visible, tangible works of the community are the definitive measure of whether it belongs to Christ or to the spirit of the age.
That is a rigorous standard for the community, I agree. The call for visible faithfulness is clear. But we have to be so careful that the condemnation of an act doesn't become the dehumanization of a person. And the material itself seems very aware of that risk. It specifically points out that Leviticus labels practices, not people, as an abomination. While the act is an abomination, the person is still called to life and repentance. If we make embodied obedience the primary metric, we risk making an individual feel like their identity is just locked into their past works. The intellectual battle has to be primary, demanding humility, demanding a surrender of authority. The goal is truth, not just outward compliance.
I completely agree that the individual is called to repentance and their dignity is paramount. But the text frames this as a zero-sum conflict between two religions, one that demands celebrate me, which is pride, and one that demands boasting only in the Lord, which happens when God has killed who you were. The visible embodied obedience is the necessary non-negotiable proof that the old self has actually been crucified. If the works of the body remain dedicated to the self, the claim of conceptual humility it lacks confirmation. Embodied works have to be the definitive metric.
And I maintain that while works are essential evidence, the text's most powerful diagnosis is rooted in that progression of pride. If we prioritize the conceptual surrendering, handing the authorship of identity back to the Creator, the embodied life will necessarily follow. The risk of focusing only on works is that we miss the theological root of the problem. We have to address the core intellectual battle over definition and ownership.
The material provides a rigorous framework for assessing both identity and action under a covenant of divine ownership, and it leaves the reader to reflect on which principle, the conceptual rejection of self-sovereignty, or the visible evidence of embodied obedience, most effectively diagnoses the problem and ultimately points toward life.